The music is set, so I guess this is for me. Welcome everybody to today's rendezvous. I'm very excited actually to have all of you here, and also a great panelist. So the objective will be clearly be to take advantage of this political momentum we see about the global renewables targets. And let me quickly go to, so that I don't forget any instructions I should give you, to my page, which I unfortunately just lost here. So I think I'm asking everybody, as for the typical rendezvous, to basically have your camera open, because we really like to see to whom we are talking to and with whom we are talking, because you will have the chance to join us basically here in the discussion. This is what it's about. And however, mic have your phone, your mic out, just so that we avoid background noises. So we have still people joining, so very warm welcome again from my side. My name is RENdezVous, for the ones of you who don't know me. I am leading REN21. And for the ones again who don't know REN21, I'm not going to show a slide this time, because I think we have really a political momentum we want to draw on. But I think it's really important to see where we come from. REN21 is, as many of you know, a global community of players from governments, industry, NGOs, science and academia, all working together to advance the global renewable energy transition in a holistic way, which means not only a fuel switch, but also the economic transitions and societal transitions. And what we clearly do, and what we do in particular also with the rendezvous, is there is a diversity of perspectives around those transitions. And we're basically building on those diversity of perspectives to really ensure, sorry, I have a noise. Can you hear me? I'm just checking whether you can hear me properly. Yes? Okay. Sorry for that. Is basically bringing the diversity of perspectives together to build the common ground, because the reality is that not everybody agrees on renewable energy, on the renewable energy transition, on how to make it happen, etc. And if we want broad societal support, support of market players, it's very important to basically bring a diversity of perspectives here. Now, why this series today focusing on the global renewable energy and energy efficiency target? It's very clear that we are living a unique moment in the history of climate talks. So if we're honest, we look at the Paris Agreement, fossil fuel phase out, all renewable energy have not been mentioned there. Today, there is a global mobilization around a global renewable energy and energy efficiency target. And this is really the first time that this is gaining attention as a possible COP outcome. It is very important for us to harness this momentum and to do everything possible to reach this COP28 agreement, or decision to triple the renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030. This is what it's about. But what is also very clear is there will be a need from diverse players to push governments to not only have the ambition, but also implement. And that we basically need the help of everybody, civil society, government, businesses, and other stakeholders for a faster and a fairer transition. Now, this ties in REN21's broader efforts to come together, obviously, as a renewables community at COP28. And I think what is really important to mention here too is that we have basically on this dialogue series, which we're organizing around this target, we're partnering here with the Global Renewables Alliance, that has clearly mobilized very strongly around this target. And we'll hear about this during future events also. And REN21 is also a strategic partner to IRENA and the Global Renewables Alliance at the Global Renewable Energy Hub at COP. So the objective is very clearly to back the 3X Renewables campaign and mobilization. So here is the RENdezVous series with a flagship dialogue initiative, the Global RENdezVous. And today, the first conversation of this series is focusing really on unpacking the global renewable energy and energy efficiency target for regional and national implementation. With this first conversation of the series, we will basically build the foundations, and very excited to have Dave with us, from Ember, who will basically help us to navigate through the whole last month of mobilization, analysis, etc., that have led us here. I think what is important to mention is we will have follow-up meetings also, specifically focusing on some voices that are probably less present in the current discussions, in particular from developing countries, but also from energy-consuming sectors. So Dave, I'm very happy to welcome you here. Dave Jones, who is a Global Insights Lead at Ember Climate, and has been following closely this momentum for this target, including and this target building, I think, that was part of the IRENA's flagship World Energy Transition Outlook, the 1.5 pathway report, to the IEA's credible pathways to 1.5, but also political announcements from the EU, Germany, and the COP presidency, just to mention some examples. So Dave, welcome again, and thanks for joining. And I give you the floor to provide your lightning talk for today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. I've been asked to explain a little bit about I guess a bit more of the background and building up to this. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion afterwards, but I want to start with a bit detail, I guess, of explaining about where we've got to so far. So this presentation has got 3 parts. The bulk of it is part 1, talking around why renewables and energy efficiency are so important. And then part 2, I'll just introduce the report from IRENA and Global Renewables Alliance that was launched today. I look forward more to Uta, who's on the call from IRENA, to talk about that launch later on during the panel discussion. And then third, I just want to finish off the presentation talking around some of the issues that we'll face as we go towards COP, around how some of the barriers that might need to be resolved as we get towards an agreement, look towards an agreement in COP. So that first section, why are renewables and efficiency so important? This slide is evidence taken from the IEA's net zero roadmap that came out last month. And what they did was they highlighted 3 areas as priority areas that need to happen to get us back on track, or get us on track towards 1.5 degrees in the energy sector by 2030. That's number 1, a tripling of renewables. That's number 2, a doubling of energy efficiency or intensity improvements. And number 3, a 3/4 drop in methane emissions. And what they produced on that, on the right-hand side there, is a chart to show, out of the reductions in emissions that happen by 2030, try to attribute some of the source of that. And about 1/3 of that is from renewables, about just over 1/3 of that is from energy efficiency and from electrification, and 1/3 from everything else. So just from the 2 things that we're talking about on this call today, on tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency, that contributes towards 2/3 of the fall in CO2, of the CO2 emissions falls by 2030. And when we look to see what those falls are in the IEA net zero target, those falls are enough to get us on track towards 1.5 degrees in the energy sector. So that is for a 35% fall by 2030, and really even faster falls as we go into the early 2030s, so that in a little over a decade, we've got a 2/3 fall in CO2 emissions from the whole of the energy sector. So that's the kind of scale of falls that are coming from the IEA net zero scenario, and where you're at the moment, the narrative is really talking around when will coal or oil and gas each peak in the next couple of years. This is going way beyond that. This is providing the means for deep and rapid reductions in CO2 emissions over a very short period of time. And there's all sorts of questions to ask of like, why this COP? Why is this coming around? Why haven't we talked about this before? But one of them is that big step up in the renewables outlook. So on the World Energy Outlook that came out, is their second flagship report that came out 2 weeks ago. They declared that shift towards clean energy is unstoppable. And what they specifically had within a scenario was a significant increase, 2/3 increase in the amount of renewables that they've seen on just on existing policies of governments that will be built by 2030. So where you see that green bar with the yellow dotted line, we need 7,000 terawatts of renewable capacity being built by between 2022 and 2030. Actually, we're kind of closing the gap on that. We've still got a long way to go, but we're closing the gap on that, and that was due to a big rise in the policy changes in the last 12 months that have come around from things like the US Inflation Reduction Act, some of the increases in the EU climate ambition, some of the more certainty over what's happening within China and their build out of clean energy, and other positive things that have happened throughout the whole of the world. And a large part of that is also reflected in additions on the ground as well. So what the latest forecast for additions in 2023 is for 500 gigawatts to be deployed this year of renewable capacity, and that's a massive surge compared to what we've seen historically. So if that outturns, it's about a 69% increase from last year. And if we were to continue building at that rate of 500 gigawatts per year, then on the right hand side you can see the orange line stretching out. It means that we're already, just by doing that, we're already on track for over a doubling of renewable capacity. And what we're lacking is that kind of bending the curve bit. So how quickly can we push additions past 500? And when you go towards tripling really is quite ambitious, and able to get that curve shifting towards up there, depending on quite how you draw that curve, you probably need around about 1,500 gigawatts per year, to 3 times what we'll have this year of renewables to be built. So it requires for the doubling, it requires building at this year's rate. For tripling, it requires to continue that growth to be tripling that annual deployment rate. And all of this really for the first time puts a tripling of renewables as an actual possibility that we can see, and we can not by any definition reach at the moment, we can see as a possibility. And I guess what's exciting for me is how this has all developed is that everything is now kind of quite aligned. So all the definitions are aligned. We're talking about the same thing. The COP delegation comes out, talks about tripling renewables to 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. That's the same as IRENA, which is basically talking about tripling renewables capacity to just over 11,000. IEA mysteriously very close to 11,000, usefully. So a complete alignment between the COP delegation, IEA, and IRENA about the definitions of what we're talking about here. And where's that renewables coming from? It's coming predominantly from solar, but also largely from wind, with some extra additions from other renewables. So a 5-fold increase in capacity of solar compared to what's on the ground at the end of last year, 3 times increase in wind, and a 40% rise in other renewables. What I've put down here down the bottom as well, it's just on the nuclear and the fossil carbon capture storage side on here as well, to show the scale of them. So yes, they're growing. Yes, they are part of this is the IEA net zero scenario. They're part of the scenario, and there require some growth within that. But you can see the numbers really pale into insignificance when you look at the massive deployment of specifically of wind and solar. So when we talk about, why a renewables target and not a clean electricity target, this is the answer. a little caveat in all of this, which is solar has obviously a much lower load factor, called like lower capacity utilization than any other renewable technology. So there is a caveat in all of this. We've got to make sure that we're not just relying on solar in here. If we do rely just on solar in here, we need more than 11,000 gigawatts. And obviously wind's been having a few issues, and there are some kind of still quite bold outlook for how much wind needs to increase. So there's a hope that wind and all other renewables technologies can play a role in that, and we don't just look to solar, even though solar is providing the bulk of the growth at the moment. And just to the other thing to bear in mind with all of this is that the kind of people, especially here in Europe, you have a mindset that this renewables coming online is displacing fossil fuel generation. But actually, less than half of it, just under half of it, is displacing, at the global level, is displacing fossil fuel generation, and just over a half of it is coming from electrifying other sectors, from electrifying cars and trucks, building industry, and also electrolyzers providing green hydrogen for electricity. So, a really important component. Sort of part of this story is the electrification of the whole of the economy, not just about how do we reduce coal and gas emissions within the power sector. And building on that, there's also some kind of, I guess, these concerns about as you build renewable electricity, what's it actually displacing? Are you able to cut emissions from that? And this chart I love from Michael Lubrick, which shows the best use of that from a carbon perspective, to use that clean electricity to be able to displace coal generation. If you use it to displace gas generation, then you're saving about half as much CO2. But interestingly, in the middle of that, you've got electric vehicles and you've got heat pumps that are saving somewhere between as much as gas and coal generation in terms of the CO2. So some really, regardless of what technology you're using in all of this, you are seeing some big reductions in CO2. It's only if you go down a route of using significant amounts for green hydrogen that you expect to see the smaller CO2 emission savings from that. So a bit of a caveat about not wanting to rely too much on green hydrogen unless you have an even faster accelerated build out of clean renewable electricity alongside that. And final word on doubling energy efficiency. Firstly, the metric, because it's not obvious what the metric of this is. When we talk about doubling energy efficiency, we're actually talking about doubling the energy intensity relative to the economy. So the primary energy needed to produce $1 of economic output, and that in the IEA modeling is 4% a year. It was only 2% in reality last year, and 1% in the 5 years before that. So there's significant progress also that needs to be made on energy efficiency. And energy efficiency really comes from three parts. It comes from electrification, where electric vehicles and the heat pumps are significantly more efficient than the technology they're replacing. It comes from a technical efficiency, which is a need to focus on best available technologies for deploying technology like air conditioning or whatever it may be, that needs to be best in class. Otherwise, you're going to be using more electricity and not having those energy efficiency savings. And a third part, which is some not insignificant changes in behavior which really happen in advanced economies and are really looking at issues around how do you not superheat your house during winter, how do you not drive at excessive speeds on the motorway, things that just a series of measures like that are packaged around behavioral changes as well that fit under the energy efficiency banner. And from all of this put together, this means 2/3 of the falls in CO2, sorry, just to summarize, 2/3 of the CO2 falls are from tripling renewables and doubling efficiency. Those CO2 falls are big enough for 1.5 degrees alignment, so 35% by 2030. The doubling of energy efficiency, so I didn't really pull this out properly on the last slide, but each of those parts on the energy efficiency side needs strong policy support, and we're used to talking about strong policy support on the renewable side, but there is strong policy support needed for each of electrification, demand behavioural changes, and also I've completely forgotten, it's gone past my mind, on the technical efficiency side. So things like efficiency standards on air conditioning units, which the best in class are using half the electricity as the average product that's actually being sold on the shelves. And the final takeaway from this section is that whole narrative now from the 2023 renewables boom that we're seeing has changed, that tripling is now seen as possible. So I'm going to touch on this report. It is released today in Abu Dhabi. It was a joint effort between the COP delegation between Global Renewables Alliance and IRENA. What it did was it was a real deep dive into some of the policy actions needed by government to be able to achieve such big scale up of renewables and such a big scale up of energy efficiency, and it had it under each of the big sections in each of these 5 headings of policy and regulation, supply chains, finance, collaboration, and infrastructure. And it is got such a wealth of suggestions within there for policymakers that enable them to really focus on what would matter for their country, that I really urge everyone to take a look and to share that with any policymakers that they know of that's looking at this. And now I just want to kind of end the discussion that probably gives a bit more of a talking point, probably more questions and answers that then lead into the panel session after this. So I'm going to close my blind, being a bit blinded by the sun that's just come out. So there's across the top, you can see a kind of a questions that are going through my mind of things that are related to the tripling of renewables that need to be brought into that COP wording. And the first one is around energy efficiency in itself. At the moment, everything, or like so much of the discussion or the basis for discussion so far has been built up around the tripling of renewables, including, sadly, the presentation that you've seen here by myself. So it's trying to find a way at every opportunity to be able to bring energy efficiency more front and center as a partner to the tripling of renewables into this, to make sure it doesn't get left out. And you saw that within the G20 text, for example, there was mentioning the tripling renewables, but there was nothing on a doubling of energy efficiency as an agreement within the G20 text. The next question is what does it mean for me? So this is obviously a big concern for countries signing up to this, is what does it mean for me? Because if you're Brazil and you have a huge amount of renewables already, it's physically possible to triple renewables capacity or triple renewables mix anymore. If you've got zero renewables, like a few countries have, it's zero, tripling zero, zero. So tripling in itself doesn't make any sense as a concept, but what so what is useful? Well, we know that just at the highest level, 40% of the world's generation would be solar and wind by 2030. And actually what the IEA did was they actually had some regional splits in that as well. So on the right-hand side for this graphic, it's really interesting. It gives some interesting regional splits in this as well. That gives a bit more of an articulation of where certain countries might need to expect to be aiming for. But by no means is that concrete in itself. And probably what all of this means from a wording perspective is, like the Paris Agreement itself, there is actual no wording on attribution. It's more of a kind of set the scene and let countries lay out on the table what they think is reasonable, and have that iteration process that the Paris Agreement has in itself when you think about how the carbon budget is split out between countries at a global level. The next problem is how do you just make sure that this isn't an empty slogan? And in the a couple of weeks ago, the COP delegation came out with a new letter to the parties. That's only their second letter so far, and some of the wording's now changed to come to COP with that tangible commitment. So this isn't just about a sign-on agreement at COP. It's actually coming to COP with with an actual plan for renewables. And what's not in this wording so far that probably needs to be in this wording is something around a review process. How do we come back after COP to see how countries are doing, see what they've got laid out on the table, see how this adds up towards a tripling? The wording on other solutions is interesting because from my perspective, and the reason why I love the phrase tripling renewables so much is it really tries to pull the oxygen away from all those other solutions that we know are solutions. They're going to happen, and then but they're all going to be fairly niche in their own way and far from ideal solutions, whether it's carbon capture or hydrogen or whatever it is, and suffocate, almost kind of suffocate those so that policymakers really focus on the thing that's most important, that's going to see the biggest CO2 emissions reductions, which is that major step up in renewables capacity. So I think the most important ask from this wording is just that it doesn't deny that oxygen. It doesn't take away the focus of that. And with a G20 wording that had that, I felt like it achieved that balance. It's got to have some other wording in there because it's got to be a hat tip towards renewables and other technologies. They are going to have a role to play as we go through into the future. So there'll be a real kind of discussion point over exactly what that sits and making sure it doesn't distract too much. On the finance side, this is all the text from the latest letter to the parties in the COP delegation document. An awful lot of it. The question is whether any of this needs to relate directly back to the tripling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency in the way they certainly have it structured at the moment is not to. But obviously in the agreement and the negotiation behind the scenes about which countries support which measure as they go through the process towards an agreement on the COP communique, clearly what's written in this finance section will have an important role over how countries are prepared to embrace a tripling of renewables, doubling of energy efficiency. And on the fossil fuel phase out, I'm not sure quite what I can say on this. Again, it's part of the negotiation scenes behind in the background. Of course, everyone wants an agreement on a fossil phase out. And how do the politics play between that when it's going towards this agreement within the communique? So really, I guess the three things that are needed from countries in this are the implementation in the first place, an actual step forward of strong and urgent policy actions. It's for a target within the negotiated text, so that's going to be a big part. But then there's also got to be that review process afterwards to make sure that this isn't just an empty slogan that just gets forgotten about. And the final slide that I want to end on is that pulls together, I guess, where Ron started with all of this, which is around the momentum and where we are today. So you've got the net zero roadmap. They're prioritizing a tripling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency. You've got Irina with WETO and then the report today prioritizing renewable tripling and doubling of energy efficiency. You've got COP delegation, which by the way started off with clauses on carbon capture, then they reissued it in July and dropped the carbon capture, but still with a hydrogen clause. And the latest bit now they've dropped what they had on hydrogen within this and just focusing on tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. So now through all these iterations, you've got all three organizations fully aligned on what countries should be doing. And really it's now kind of laid out nicely to those countries to see how they're going to react. Because at the moment, all of this is quite a new process in terms of exactly how all these are laid out, and politicians are still in kind of thinking mode about how they're going to support it and what it means for them. And really, the scene is set where it's really down to those countries now to see how strongly they are able to support into this and whether they're able to make a global commitment at COP happen on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. That's very, very helpful. It also shows, I think, the complexity. So there is really a political momentum. And on the other hand, we will need to ensure that it's going to be implemented collectively, and probably there will be a diversity of ways of how it's being implemented. So I think there was we had like one clarification question from Ben which I'm going to ask before we're moving to the panel discussion. So the tripling is global, and countries then assess and commit to how they contribute to this. So Dave, maybe you want to dive into this, because I think it's already leading us to the implementation, and then later to panel discussion.
So much to say on this, but then also not say on this. Like I kind of tried to articulate just during the presentation, which is this is going to take more than just every country make a straight tripling, because it doesn't make sense that a straight tripling of what a country has today. So for some countries, it might make sense to where India at the moment has promised a tripling of capacity by 2030 of 450 gigawatts versus about 150 gigawatts they had last year. That makes sense. They've started a big build up already. Where you've got some countries on zero already, then tripling doesn't make any sense. So it'd be interesting to see how countries can do that. There's no formula for way to be able to do that. One way to do it is measuring on shares, which is why I tried to pull out that 40% wind, solar and wind global share as a benchmark, because countries are on this kind of like beginning of a journey on wind and solar build up at the moment. So that's all I can really say on it at the moment. There is no way to be able to, that I've seen so far, any proposal I've seen to be able to formulate that. It's really for people to use it as a benchmark to think what's reasonable for them.
Okay, thank you so much. So Dave, you'll stay with us for the discussion. I think we'll have a, now I would like to welcome Ute Collier from IRENA. Ute is the Deputy Director, Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center at the International Renewable Energy Agency. She's responsible for IRENA's work on policy, markets, finance for the energy transition. And Ute, you also co-led IRENA's annual flagship publication, the World Energy Transition Outlook, which is one of the key foundations, I think, of the global target discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, IRENA as an intergovernmental organization has a key role to play to mobilize the governments now to also step forward. So looking forward to your thoughts. And we have with us Elias Spiekermann, who is a policy advisor at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, who is also joining us here. Normally, he might join us a bit later. Because why Germany? Germany has actually been one of the governments really pushing forward the global renewable energy target, global renewable energy and energy efficiency target into a political space also. And yeah, we're looking forward to learn more about Germany's and Europe's mobilization around it. So you have heard, I think, Dave's presentation. So Ilya, thanks also for joining us. Ute, let me start with you. Maybe after having heard Dave's discussion, and we also have like some questions here where he said like you could jump in. Obviously, this question about how this renewable energy and energy efficiency target is being shaped, there were lots of discussions in the lead up to it. So we know that, for instance, from the European Commission side, there were discussions about rather having a renewable energy share. But then there is a question also between what makes sense content analytically, but also what are political targets. What is maybe your perspective, Ute, on where the global renewable energy and energy efficiency target stands today, and also the current level of support you can see from IRENA's side?
Okay, thank you and good evening from Abu Dhabi. I mean, just first of all on, you know, the renewable energy target specifically. I mean, when I first got roped into working on this report, as you know, Rana, I'm always one for advocating the need to look at end-use sectors and not just the power sector, because politicians in particular get very obsessed with the power sector and forget that actually I think the power's electricity still only something like 20% of global energy consumption. I mean, of course, we say it will go up by 2050. We need to have massive electrification of the end-use sectors, but it does seem to be forgotten that there's also direct renewables, etc. But that aside, you know, at the same time, you just sometimes got to be realistic. The power sector target like this capacity is a relatively simple target for people to understand. And of course, also a good thing is we definitely have good data to measure it. I mean, here at IRENA, we have a statistics team who pulls together this data from governments. And I know there are all these estimates, like Dave already showed, 2023 capacity additions, but we actually get all this final data from the member states. I mean, most countries are member states, and by the end of we usually publish it in March, so we get these sort of ultimate data on that. So it's easy to measure. So I think that's kind of helpful. And, you know, we've got to, because so many governments are totally behind on renewables in the end use sector. I mean, let's start with this. If we can get a global agreement on that, that would be a major way forward. So today and tomorrow in Abu Dhabi, the COP presidency has organized a so-called pre-COP, where there seem to be a lot of people there already, certainly 60 plus ministers, and then of course various people from the delegations. I'm sure there's some people from BMWK are there. I saw someone from the embassy, but I'm not sure where the delegation was at that time. And we launched this report to a room full of, well, people from delegations, but also the UAE energy minister was there, very strongly advocating this pledge. And, you know, this is a country which has only fairly recently started expanding its renewable capacity. So it's really important that they're on board. And just sort of clarifying some of the stuff we discussed, or Dave started mentioning earlier on, they are certainly asking people to, well, so the idea is, yes, it's a global target, and then in typical COP fashion, you know, in the end, it's up to countries to propose what they want to propose, but they're urging countries to come forward with ambitious targets. They've thought about the review process, and they said that the breakthrough, which came from the Glasgow COP, is part of it, which is, you know, a process where we as international organizations are involved, but there is a lot of monitoring going on through that already. And then there will be, the idea is that there will be a special annual pledge monitoring activity to see what that entails. And I mean, certainly, you know, there was lots of positive comments today at this session. A very strong intervention from Kenya, who are excellent in this space, and reminding everyone we need to think about energy access, and it's off-grid, the renewables need to come in, etc. as well. And they were saying they were trying to get lots of African countries to sign on. Obviously, the finance question comes in there. And of course, so far, very few countries will want to commit themselves yet. But the COP presidency is asking countries to submit their intentions by the mid of November, and then come with the actual proposed target for themselves by the COP. So, I mean, it's the most political momentum I've ever seen behind something like this. And considering, you know, I go back a long time with these COPs, and I dropped out many decades ago now because I find it so glacial. But what we see happening here on renewables seems as if we might actually achieve more than on some of the other issues where we just don't seem to see much progress. So let's see. Anyway, I'm more optimistic now today than I sometimes can be on COP outcomes.
Yes, I must say, like, I'm very happy because I know Ute very well, and so I'm very happy to hear this enthusiasm, actually, because there is I think this is indicating that there are some really good discussions ongoing, and the mobilization around it that is really happening. And I think it's so I guess, like, Elias, I would like to turn to you. Germany is one of those government that has actually, as a government, put forward also this engagement and the mobilization around the global renewable energy target and the efficiency target, global renewable energy and efficiency target. What are your thoughts today, where things stand? What are the continuous mobilizations of Germany in the lead up to COP, and what is your view?
Thanks a lot, and hi to all. I hope you can hear me fine. My video is a little bit slow on my side, so I hope
Yes, we
my
can hear
voice
you.
is not. Okay, perfect. So where we are standing right now, this is a good question. We are like 1 month ahead of COP. That's where we're standing. And I guess there is still a lot of work to do to come up to this global momentum to reach a consensus on the global targets on renewable energy and energy efficiency. I guess for us, if I may say this at the beginning, it's very important that we not only have the pledge as on the sidelines of the COP on the so-called action agenda, but for us, it's very important to have it as a COP decision in the end, possibly as a GST outcome, to inform the new NDC updates and the way towards 2030. This is for us a very high in the agenda and key for us to push this towards COP and beyond. I guess COP28 can only be a starting point for this agenda. We will not have all the answers to the questions that were partly already put on the table when it comes to financing, when it comes to access. These are questions that have been out for a long time, and we will not solve them within 1 month. But I guess it's important to have the pledge and a COP decision on the topic as a starting point, and then jointly work on this agenda with all stakeholders, as you said in the beginning, Rana, to 2030 and beyond. Ute said the power sector is not the energy sector, but the power sector is one of the solutions to decarbonize the energy sector and the whole society and economic activities that we're seeing daily. So I guess there are huge potentials. And Dave, thanks for your presentation. I guess it's very, very interesting. It's not news, but very informative. We know from the last IPCC report, but also before, the high potential of renewables, the high potential of energy efficiency. And that's why Germany is also pushing these targets and the goals. And it's also very nice to see again the role of other solutions, other technologies towards 2030 and beyond. They are for sure there, they will play a role, but the highest mitigation potential at lowest cost is with the two approaches that we're discussing today. Maybe I stop here and then come back later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess I have one question, which is I'm probably building on the technical one, but also bringing in the developing country perspective. Dave, I think you had shown that a lot of part of the new renewable power capacities is basically used to decarbonize energy-consuming sectors through the electrification. Now, admittedly, especially when we're taking the example of developing countries, this is one of the typical tension points which we also observe, that here it is about building up not only energy access but fueling the economy. So and when we're looking at so very often under the COP part, it is obviously avoiding future emissions, but also building up resilient energy infrastructure. How do you all three of you see these discussions basically ongoing, and what are entry points that would allow us to mobilize, I guess, like the global community around it? So Ute, it was really great to hear that Kenya has been pushing very much, but maybe you could also share some of their narratives around it.
But I mean, so Kenya was very strongly saying, okay, you know, for them, renewables are energy security, because, of course, they were previously very dependent on diesel. I mean, both in off-grid and on-grid situations. And I mean, they're very lucky because they've been able to develop geothermal quite strongly. One of the few countries in the world, actually, which has made real progress. And I mean, she was saying that it was kind of a game changer for them. So I think those kind of narratives are really important for developing countries. you know, because if we just come with our usual, well, you know, the costs of renewables have dropped so much, but I mean, we all know there is an issue in developing countries that actually the cost of renewables are quite a lot higher because the cost of capital is so high for many of the countries, especially, you know, obviously where there are all sorts of political risks, and they pay so much more for renewables that have become very cheap for us in developed countries. So positive examples from countries like Kenya, who can then lead and mobilize other countries, I think are really important. And I mean, I feel very strongly about sort of energy access element. I mean, what we do here at IRENA is kind of always push it, even though, let's face it, in terms of this 2030 pledge, it's neither here nor there, because what we're going to get in terms of off-grid renewables is not going to make a massive difference to those 11,000 gigawatts, whatever it is. But we can't have this transition happening without actually solving the access problem as well. And we do have the SDGs, which, you know, are becoming very hard to achieve. So I think it all needs to be part of the same package. And we need to show people that is important, and that we mustn't forget that side of things, even if it isn't maybe essential for achieving that pledge. Mm-hmm. And that everything counts. I mean, that's in the end important in this narrative. Yes, we're saying, okay, as part of the tripling, maybe it's not important, but then it's important in the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jutta. Elias, I saw you nodding. So what is your view on this? Also, because I think you're also mobilizing globally. The European Commission has clearly also pushed forward. So how do you see the approach and the involvement of developing countries?
It's key. It's the key, and it's the most important to have the countries on board where renewable energies will probably and can play a huge potential in fueling economic development and in driving up the access rates to energy. And Ute said, yes, in some countries where renewable energies will play a key role, the absolute numbers of capacities will be limited. However, they will still play a huge role in those countries and are key for the way ahead. We hope that a pledge and having the goals within the COP decision will send clear signals to the markets, to investors, to developers, and we hope that this will make it easier in the coming years to implement the solutions on the ground. And now I again talked only about renewables, and I'm always not being tired of saying and energy efficiency, because also in countries where the energy demand is not that high at the moment and where many people don't have access, we have difficulties in the grid, so grid losses of energy and other energy efficiency issues that need to be tackled in addition, because renewable energy or the power of renewable energy is a scarce source, and we have to treat it like it.
Yeah, thank you very much for highlighting this. I think also it builds on the finance part too, because it reduces the systems cost ultimately. And we're building up a huge new energy demand also in developing countries, and should do it in an efficient way. Dave, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was worried about running over, so at the last second I culled a slide which answers directly to your point. Well, at least it illustrates your point slightly. I love this slide. It shows the change in India electricity mix over the last 10 years from 2012 to 2022. 90% of the rise in electricity demand was met by coal generation. And it points, and we did an analysis of India's national electricity plan that they have to 2032. And from that, you can see what they're planning to do already is 2/3 of that electricity demand rise that they're looking at would be met by wind and solar alone. So that's like in total what all of this means. All of this means it's not just about how you restricting energy use, it's about how you growing at the same time as growing it clean. And you can see that total line for the electricity demand is basically twice what it was in the last decade, as when you energy use is coming through. The energy use as the economy grows is coming predominantly in the electricity sector, rather where historically it's come across all the other sectors more evenly. So I hope that demonstrates the point a little bit. There's just on what we're seeing on that, specifically on the India side. We'd love you can see that India already has a kind of proposal for the triple renewables, and it'll be really nice for them to come out with some nice words and support this. At the moment, I guess, like that kind of share that same enthusiasm that Uta's got, which you see countries kind of lining up behind this, but it's about who is actually going to kind of step up into this, in what order, to choreograph this in the right way. So a big question is, what does India do within this? And that's so related to what happens on the finance deal, because India's first question on everything around this is around climate finance. So how does that finance package look like in total coming out of the COP delegation, the COP communique? And is that enough to give the global south reassurance of what they need, that they have got money that they can step up into a world of tripling renewables? Thanks.
Thank you. So I think the finance deal is really important. What are your views on this? Do you see that is there movement? Is there enough movement? Because this will obviously be fundamental on the developing country support too. So Dave, do you want to give like a...
I'd love the only thing that I really want to say on it is to pull out the difference between the kind of the different packages, because so much of the issue for financing for renewables and energy efficiency is the fact they're very capex heavy, especially renewables is very capex heavy. It's upfront, big investments that are needed. Like you said, emerging economies don't have access to that cheap rate to capital that we've seen in the developed world over the last decade, and that's what's been stifling them. That's what's been keeping them, what's been holding back progress for them. So really, when we talk about finance, this is about access to concessional loans, to not grants but loans on the ground that can enable not hundreds of billions but trillions worth of dollars worth of investment.
Thank you. Ute, Elias, before we move to the next question.
Yes, I mean, IRENA published its report on the global landscape of renewable energy finance earlier this year, and quite clearly showed that there's still very little money flowing into, especially Africa, for renewables. I think over the last 2 decades, it's only actually been 22% of the whole investment. And in a way, it's getting worse in terms of the share of the global investments is actually going down rather than up. So it's clearly something we need to address. We've got a problem with so many countries being heavily indebted. So to keep on pushing loans, which still actually cost a lot of money to pay back, is very tricky. I mean, at least there is a lot of debate now about the need to reshape international, where the multilateral development banks and international finance. I know it hasn't moved very fast now, but you know, a couple of years ago, barely anyone talked about it. So at least that's something. I'm not sure I'm very optimistic about what comes out of the COP, because I mean, I can't think of any COP which has, well, even if they've committed to the money, then they haven't paid up afterwards. So that's not a very good precedent. But yeah, I mean, you know, Kenya at this event did make that point again. It just can't happen without the finance commitment, certainly from Africa. And yes, of course, India will push for it as well. So let's see. One kind of positive thing was that certainly the UAE said that they need to work with other GCC countries, and part of that was the finance aspects, that they do understand that to get these more global, broader commitments, there needs to be finance. And of course, you know, there are some good examples, the way Mazda has financed projects in a number of developing countries, but it's still a drop in the ocean at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Elias, any thoughts from your side? Compliment?
Well, there's a significant amount of people in the German government working on this topic. I'm not, I have to admit. Therefore, I can't give in-depth perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
However, Ute, you mentioned commitments that may not be lived up to. I hope we will see this year that the 100 billion will be reached. However, this 100 billion, as Dave said, are not enough at all to push the transition where we want to see it. And I guess therefore we also need to work on other topics. The COP discussions around 2.1c, mobilization of private finance is, I guess, a very important point, even so very difficult, even at the moment. And I guess we also need to think about other options, such as carbon markets and additional finance options that are not that untapped right now.
Maybe just before opening one number which I always have in mind is like this role of private finance and how public finance is being used to mobilize private finance. And I think in the G20, in the lead up to G20, there was an analysis that normally we should use like $1 to mobilize $10 of public of private finance, and for the moment in the G20 the rate is at 0.47, which I found really shocking when I heard this, and I thought like, okay, maybe that's also, you see, numbers sometimes really indicate the way forward. So anyways, before opening the floor to the community here, I think we have very clearly seen there are different levers. The way how to basically bring the target and the mobilization around the target from the governments to COP is not very determined, I guess. How countries are also implementing is not really determined yet. From your views, I would be really, and there are many levers. So we heard like energy efficiency policies, renewable energy policies. You can work from the capacity side to the end use sectors, etc. What are your views on the most effective way forward? What are the 3 actions that really need to happen? Who wants to jump first?
Can you just clarify the 3 actions to
you see
what?
Like three focal activities or focus activities, so that we do not only have this political momentum of a renewable energy and energy efficiency target at COP, which I think is just really a great so happening for the first time, but that this also really materializes in not only ambition but implementation.
Yeah,
and
well,
what can you see, like the question is also, what can the COP presidency do? What can governments do, or intergovernmental organizations? But also, given the fact that we have basically here the multi-stakeholder community, so I'm just adding another layer of to the question, what can be done by all those players who are participating in the call today? So.
Okay, I think let me start with number 1, and that the COP presidency has said that already, that these pledges then need to be translated into the NDCs. And also what I would say, because what we found we do this analysis every year of renewable energy targets and how they compare with the NDCs, and it's really weird, like they don't necessarily match. So it clearly, a country needs to, if it puts it in the NDCs, it needs to be the same as the actual policy targets that have been announced. And then, of course, we do need a strategy to implement that. That's number one. I mean, number two clearly is this finance element where we do need this international financing, international collaboration, where the multilateral development banks, the bilateral donors somehow need to come together to work out a plan for the financing. But the third one, I would say, is actually the involvement from multiple stakeholders. I mean, you know, and that includes, I think, pressure from the ground up that this needs to be delivered. I mean, we see many countries where, well, you know, not mentioning any names, but to some extent, renewables have become part of the culture war. And you know, there seems to be a thing going on where politicians row back on some of the commitments rather than going forward. And there needs to be pressure from the bottom up, from communities, from NGOs, etc., showing that that's what people want. They want the implementation. So it needs to be the pledge at the top and the pressure from the bottom.
So Elias, pressure from the bottom. Is it something the German government is also looking for?
Yes, absolutely. Because I guess first we need a mobilization towards COP28 to not only have the pledges, because the global goals will only be an informative starting point for the NDCs if we manage to have them, as I said before, in the COP28 decision. And this needs a multi-stakeholder approach and ask from different stakeholders and not only some governments. Second, I guess this is the short to medium term, and this is also what Ute said and we just discussed. I guess we need to look on the finance side and to tackle the most important challenges that we face for renewable and energy efficiency rollout or development. And for the third point, I give the word to Dave, maybe.
That's
So
good.
Dave only had 1 point. No, you have 3 points, Dave, also. Elias,
No. Only one point. There's some questions appearing, which is great. So, but no, I only really want to make 1 point, which is that if renewables and energy efficiency are 2/3 of the solution to the pathway to the next decade, then they're going to be 2/3 of the focus area for governments as well. So how do we get governments kind of stop looking around all these different technologies and getting confused everywhere, and really making sure that every single conversation they talk about climate and energy starts with renewables and energy efficiency?
So maybe a quick follow-up question on this, Dave. I mean, we always speak about the energy literacy of climate negotiators and how we can, because the entry points are very different if you come from the climate side or from the sustainable energy side, I guess. How can we collectively improve on this, I guess?
Gosh, what a big question. I don't quite know where to start with that. I think just starting with that overall vision, realizing how much I talked about it really nicely on her intervention when she first started, which is around that, like, this isn't just about the power sector, this is about the whole of the energy sector. So how do you, if you start off with like an end vision, which is most of the economy is going to be like about how you get to net zero, which is most of the economy is going to be electrified, you're going to end up with an electricity sector like 2 to 3 times bigger than today. And it's going to be mostly largely variable renewables, but a selection of other clean electricity and balancing around that. Then that gets you in the headset of what you need to do to be able to achieve that. And it was interesting reading the report today from Irina that launched, which was so much of it was talking about that top level of prioritizing the electricity system as one as a whole. And I think governments are not always in that mindset. So how do you, when we talk about efficiency specifically and electrification, how specifically do we talk about electric charging points and what we need to do to roll out faster on electric cars? What do we need to do about air conditioners to make sure they don't consume huge amounts of electricity in fast growing countries where that's a problem, and make it specific?
Thank you. I think this is something we clearly see from REN21 side, and I've seen Ben is online from WRI, but this link to the transport sector, and we see that there is really a mobilization from transport sector side also on fossil fuel free land transport, where we see, okay, there is also momentum of bringing basically sectors together and push for something more holistic. I think it's time to open the seat up for our participants to join, and I'm really happy to see that we have some hands up. So I'm really sorry I didn't see who was first. So I'll just start with Abu Bakr, Bahaj, if you could, or Konrad, fine. So the tech team has decided that would be Konrad. Please, Konrad, what is your question? What is your contribution?
Well, okay, to the tech team, but in particular, thank you to you. I feel we spoke about the big picture, the political commitment, the financing commitment, and I just wanted to go down to the very basic ground level, skills and installation capacity constraints. And my understanding is that even in a country like Germany, very highly developed, these are binding constraints. So if you could speak to that and where you would see for the international community any leverage to relieve or reduce this constraint, which would be really a tragedy if we can mobilize the political and the financial support, and then we fail because we simply don't have enough capacity to actually roll this out in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Konrad. So who would like to take this? Ute.
So skills and capacity was actually amongst one of the enablers in our report, and we certainly identified this as an issue. I think we all have stories about, well, either the lack of capacity of installers or installers that are not very well trained. So we have issues like, you know, on the end use sector, bad heat pump installations. That's been going on for some time. To some extent, I think in some countries, this sort of over time seems to be sorting itself out, you know, as the demand grows, more people train. You need to have the government put in proper certification schemes, etc. That's certainly important. And then I think for the developing countries part of it, we do see, one of the things we've argued is that public funding isn't just about helping de-risking projects. It also needs to be about the enabling environment, and training of skilled staff is of course part of this. So, you know, I know to some extent this is already happening in the multilateral development banks, but there needs to be more of a strategy for that. And Germany, I guess, you know, I'm just thinking GIZ, for example, is doing a huge amount of capacity building, for example, aren't they?
Dave?
Well, one of the kind of the reasons stepping back, like why do you want a triple renewables target, doubling energy efficiency target? Part of it is to be able to make sure that there's a vision going forward about how much is going to be built and what needs to happen to get to that level of ambition. So it may sound a bit kind of floaty and a bit, oh, it's just a target, like, well, so it's not actually helping implementation, but in some ways it does plan for that. It enables people to sit down when they're thinking through their career. Oh, right, this is going to be like a major sector. Enables governments or like local agencies to be able to go through it. Okay, right, okay, this is going to be an important point for skilling in the future. So there is a direct link, an indirect link, however you want to put it, back in from that high level target back to this. And there's so, like you mentioned a few there, Conrad, but there's so many like issues to making this level of transition happen. It's unbelievable. So like just at the highest level, there's going to be a vision that governments are signing into, just to be able to try to articulate how big are they going to build it within that country, and then build some stability, and then building up a stability of policy and everything that needs to happen underneath that can be allowed to happen from there.
Okay. Elias, anything on the jobs, or we move on? We have other questions.
I just want to say, I guess it's very different from country to country. What are the challenges? What are the needs? So I guess it's difficult to answer the question easily. As Ute said, the International Climate Initiative and BMZ projects via GIZ do have a strong focus on this topic. But I guess in the end, it's very much what Dave also said. The focus of the governments need to be on the solutions. And once they're there, the issues in the countries are hopefully on the highest of the agenda and will be tackled with a whole of society approach.
I think in maybe like to complement, because during the next RENdezVous, actually we'll have also focus on the mobilization from the private sector side, and with the Global Renewables Alliance, for instance, joining, they have done a huge mobilization around it, and with very strong messages also from the skilling side, but also building a sustainable renewable industry. Not only locally, but I think globally and anchored regionally to also address supply chains, etc. I think there are really, big questions with concrete asks from the industry side. So we'll have during the next RENdezVous the possibility to also dive into this more in detail. I think I'm just going to call Abubakar Bahaj now to join us here in the panel and share your question.
I have got 2 points to raise, and some of them have got questions. The first one is around energy access. I really like the comments that energy access is going to be a really major issue with us, in spite of the fact that we're trying to do something about it. For example, the required investment is about $80 billion per year to provide energy access by 2030. We are nowhere close to that. And it's really important to recognize this, because we've got other pressures which are also important, which is net zero. And we are all driving into net zero, and we seem to forget about the 600 million people. And add to that the clean cooking issues, 2.8 billion and so forth. All these issues are interconnected. And if we solve them in the developing countries setting, that would be really great. So that's one point. Second point, we're talking about energy efficiency. A lot of talk about that to happen very soon, very quickly, because it's part of the net zero journey. I think a lot of people are missing the point that energy efficiency will need to happen in cities, and cities are curtailed in terms of their power. A lot of cities, especially in Europe, do not have enough power in their wires to allow them to go for heat pumps and electric vehicles. And this is something totally missed by the national grid and by the DNOs, the distributed network people. And this disconnect between the two makes it very difficult, not only in terms of net zero, but also in terms of economic growth within cities. So would the panel have any views to see how we can unlock both two options for us, energy access and power requirement in cities?
So who wants to take this? Thank you so much, Abubakar, for raising these questions.
I mean, just on energy access, we're actually down to 2.3 billion on the clean cooking, apparently, but of course, those figures are still uncertain. Look, I mean, IRENA, together with the IEA, WHO, UN, the World Bank, we've been doing this tracking exercise ever since they've agreed on SDG 7. Every year we say not enough is being done. Every year we make recommendations. Every year the international community fails to allocate enough money to it. I don't know. I mean, there are some things that seem to be moving, you know, with say in the clean cooking space, where we get many more initiatives now within Africa with some international financing support, but it's quite frustrating. I don't know, we just got to keep trying, and that's why we always throw it in, no matter what we discuss, and hence we put it into this pledge report that it doesn't get forgotten.
Thank you, Dave.
It was interesting to see Fatia from the IEA going out on a bit of a limb, or what's the phrase, going out on almost a sales mission to the European Commission, the European Union, to ask how they can support an Africa clean cooking campaign financially. So I wonder what momentum that will get from within the European Commission, whether the European Union, and whether there'll be some money that will be able to support that, because that's a really nice way to be able to mobilize some of the funding that's needed for such a critical problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave. Maybe on the city side, Elias, I know you looked into the cities part. Is this maybe something you want to? Because city governments are not sitting around the table at COP, right? So, but have a key role to play.
No, but I guess they will be present in Dubai, because we will have the summit, local governments on the 1st and 2nd. But Rana, maybe you are in a good position to come in on this question, even though you're the moderator here, because you did great work on this topic. Maybe it's okay if I give the question to you.
Okay, I'm quickly changing the hat, you mean? Okay, yes, indeed. I think, I think what we've clearly seen, so REN21 has, and I'll just take a very short time on this, but has produced 2 global renewables in cities global status reports. And what was really interesting is to see that there is a massive mobilization from city governments around renewable energy. There are 30% of the urban population actually living in cities that have a renewable energy or climate target. But what we also see is that very often city governments are not always supported, whether it is access to resources, financial resources, and knowledge to really implement, even though they have a real role to play, especially and they are very close to citizens who are today facing the anti-poverty part. So very clearly from REN21 side, a very strong message that with climate and energy access, or with climate, we're speaking about a global problem, but that leads local solution and implementation. And that's clearly something that is also reflected on the DSO, TSO side. But yeah, we'll maybe take this as a follow-up discussion topic to after COP to see how we implement. Just because we have so many other questions, and I'll just ask Miguel to join me here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Look, I'm happy, Rana, that you are in Paris, I suppose, and I'm in Santiago, because otherwise you would throw me your shoes to me, and it's too far to do that. You must be sick and tired of my concern. But let me try to explain it the best way I can. The question we have to pose ourselves, and I honestly mean it because I've been all over the place. Are we barking at the right tree? I'm sorry to be so Trotskyist or so nihilist about this. The problem I see in the focus we seem to take is that COP and all these organizations are run by governments, public sector institutions, multilaterals, which have a public sector approach to life. And certainly there is a lot to do about that. But are they the real drivers, or are we kidding ourselves? You produce fantastic models, you and intellectualize about the issue, and I have virtually no issue about what you're saying. But it's so easy to make projections, put models, put underlying assumptions about what is needed to achieve this and that target, put it in front of a meeting, and then ask for pledges. It's very easy to pledge and make commitments for using resources that you don't have, and the market isn't willing to provide. It seems to me that what we are missing here is an understanding of civil society, of how to hold accountable authorities, of how incentive structures work, how you mobilize the private sector, and what kind of setup policies you have to have so that it provides the resources, so that the demand of the power sector, etc., says what it needs. I tell you, we have done a little bit of this exercise over here in Chile. The first thing we did was to compare what different countries have done. If you look at our analysis, you would scoff at it of saying how primitive it is, and it is very primitive, but it is better to be vaguely right than definitely wrong. We put country by country, alphabetically, starting with Germany. German and Spanish starts with A, Alemania. And we looked at what they have done, with what results, with how much resources have they put in, with what institutional arrangements, and that was an eye-opener for civil society and various NGOs and the government of figuring out what the hell do we do? How capable are we or incapable we are to do, say, what Germany has done. What we have seen is impressive what they have done, but the amount of the resources that they put in and how they focused on almost single-mindedly in a certain direction, and therefore how they played with their energy security. It was very helpful for us to hear out our consumers, what they wanted and what they didn't want. And therefore, we went for a very different route, much more liberal, because we knew our government is incapable of managing all these things, that the government should be an enabler, putting policies in place so that the various players that have to be there do the right decisions, etc. And by and large, I would say we have been reasonably successful in terms of, by now we have about, 63% of renewables of generation in the power sector, 75% if you include hydro and thermal. You look at the tremendous amount of additional investments that are in the pipeline, which seem to suggest that we will be going there without all this machinery of these are the goals, this is the resources we have to move, etc., but rather let the pricing system, the private utilities figure out these complex issues because they are closer to the ground and respond to the demand. You are
Miguel,
now,
sorry.
let me just summarize one thing for you. I've been asked by several colleagues to write up what have we in Chile learned from the world and what the world can learn from us. It will not meet your standards, Rana, but if you can translate that into the vocabulary of the people you deal with, that would be fantastic. You'll have it in about a few weeks.
Okay, this sounds really good. So I take this offer, Miguel, and I promise you that even if you were sitting here in Paris, admittedly, I'm in Vienna, so I wouldn't throw a shoe at you because I think this is exactly the discussions and the critical questions we need. So what I'll do is, just because we're coming close to an end, I would like to, before sharing the question with the panelists, also I ask Janet Milongo to quickly join us here on the panel. Janet, if you could share your thoughts very quickly, and then I'll give the panelists the time to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Rana. Mine is a quick one. It's just a quick question stroke comment. I'm wondering whether there's been some thinking or contributions, discussion, whatever the case may be, especially from governments around safeguards or guardrails for renewables, especially when we're talking about raw materials, because the kind of capacity deployment we're talking about here is massive, and that would have a massive strain on our resources, particularly from a developing country perspective. The concern and even experiences around resource curses are real. And so I'm just wondering whether there's been any conversations around that, or what the thoughts of the panelists are on how to go about that. Ourselves at CAN International have done some thinking on that, and I'm happy to throw a link in the chat on where we've reached on that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. Yes, if you could put the link, because the discussions will continue, I think, during next series. But I think, yeah, question to all three of you. Critical minerals and safeguards. I think this is probably not only in the critical minerals, but then I would really like to hear your thoughts on Miguel's question. Do we park the car at the wrong tree? I think that's how you have said it. And what is really necessary? So is a global solution and global strategy really guiding the way for the country that need to come to COP? Who would like to start? And we have 5 minutes left, so I would ask you to be short on this.
Okay, if no one else wants to start, I'll start. Critical materials, this is something we are doing quite a bit of thinking about at ARENA, and I know our friends in Paris are doing it as well at DIA. You know, clearly it is an issue. We did publish a report on the geopolitics of it earlier this year. And we're particularly concerned as well about what it means in terms of mining in you know, especially in developing countries, and clearly safeguards need to be developed. So yes, that is something we're concerned about. But coming to Miguel's point, look, I mean, first of all, you can't compare with what happened in Germany when we developed renewables, and Elias can speak more about this. He's representing the government. But those were the days when renewables wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been massive public subsidies. Nowadays, it's much easier to develop renewables because the costs have come down so much, because we've had the learning, and Germany has helped us do that globally. So clearly, it needs to be a combination of everything. Of course, the private sector will have to mobilize the fund, but the governments, the pledges are important. We need to have the target setting, the strategy, and we need the governments then to do things like remove fossil fuel subsidies because the markets are distorted, etc. I mean, my faith in markets is a bit limited because they do not work properly. We all know they do not include carbon pricing, etc. So I think governments are important, and a global pledge is one way to get some reluctant governments on board. But then, yes, everyone needs to play a role in it. Over to next person.
So you throw the ball to Elias.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess the global goals that we're aiming for at the moment are part of this enabling framework that Miguel mentioned in the end. I guess setting the targets, placing the topic high on the agenda is part of the enabling framework that we need. And how this is reached in the different countries, this is up to the discussion in the specific countries. So I guess, at least as I see, we are more or less in line with what you said. So I guess we are on at the right tree, and we will need to see how this trickles down to the NDCs in the end, and what are the approaches in the different countries. And yes, the situation in Germany back in the day was a little bit different to today, as Ute said. So fully support this.
Dave, over to you.
Janet's got a great point. We didn't spend enough time talking about safeguards at all. There's so many problems that's going to come through that as we go through the transition that are going to unfold. There's a whole load of benefits that we expect from the transition in terms of jobs and impact on energy prices and security and everything else. I've got to make sure that they get delivered. And what's really critical in that is that where governments have a role in trying to set some of those goalposts, how do they step up their own capacity? Because we're not talking about just the climate ministry here. We're talking about the whole of the government machinery needs to have extra capacity to deal with these issues, whether it's around land use or critical minerals or whatever it is. So some real testing times on that, and that's a real issue for the governments. Will need to keep front and center as we scale up, but especially with the speed that we need to. Just two things on Miguel's point. The first one is that it's just, I think there's a bit of frustration that maybe it looks like renewables hasn't delivered so far. We're at 12% of our electricity from wind and solar last year globally. If that had been met from fossil fuels, it would have been fossil fuel generation would have been 20% higher than it was already. Already there's that moment in there. And what's happening now is renewables is actually stepping up to the next level where you're seeing a big amount coming online. The amount of solar panels coming online this year, if that's all that's used just on electric, if all of it were to be used just on charging electric cars, it would knock 2 million barrels of oil a day off of global oil demand. We've reached that scale now where the amount of renewables coming online is now reaching that next level where it can start bending the curve very, very rapidly. And just on the final point where about COP as a target, I hate this whole, I don't hate it as much as you do at all, but I understand why you're talking about why COP and why targets and all of this. But one of the big things for me on this, and one of the things that make me really excited about having this in the COP agenda, is making sure that every energy ministry and climate ministry across the whole of the world, when they're talking and trying to articulate their own positions on climate and energy, they start with the words renewable and energy efficiency. And if they can do that, then they can get to 2/3 of the solution, or 2/3 of the way down to what we need to bend the curve on emissions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So from my side, I would say, like, thanks to all three of you, and thanks to all participants for joining in and sharing your perspectives. I don't think that we do not only have answers, Miguel, we do not only have answers, but we have entry points. I think we have also some critical questions which we'll need to collectively tackle. We're all speaking about a process that has started in the past and that will lead us to the future, that is happening indeed in a global context at COP, that needs implementation regionally, nationally, locally. And as we heard from all of you, with not only a push from the government side, but very clearly from industry and civil society. So top down and bottom up. Now, I clearly think to build on this, we have this momentum, and this is exciting. It puts actually energy at the heart of the climate discussions, but also at the heart of the economic discussions. And I think this is where we also see a mobilization, I think, that is quite new around it, not only from the climate ministry side, but also energy, the finance ministries, transport ministries in certain countries. And this is probably a momentum we need to collectively put forward and really build upon, I guess, in our different ecosystems we're working on. So the power sector is not the energy sector, but the target is a very good signal to get national discussions started. We collectively have a responsibility here to mobilize ourselves to not only have discussions, but that we're really delivering on this, and that we hold governments also accountable for implementing. Certainly with really taking into account the different countries' realities. And I think what I find really interesting, and I'm going to echo Dave's comment here, is we see a shift in the norm. I do think that energy efficiency and renewable energy have become something that is the norm today when we're looking into the future. And the COP28 language and mobilization here is clearly an opportunity for all of us to push. From REN21 side, we will continue those discussions. We'll certainly follow up with the ones of you have said, like, you're going to share thoughts, stories, because this is exactly what we need. So Miguel, we are going to translate your insights from Chile. Janet, also, you have shared some things, so looking forward to this. And these discussions are going to continue. We will have a next rendezvous where we will have a focus in particular on, sorry, I have a very long list of messages and I need to find the right one, sorry. On the 15th of November, strengthening our voice at COP28, our collective push for the renewable energy and energy efficiency target. where we'll clearly have with Global Renewables Alliance insights shared, first of all, from the industry side, but also they've really built a whole mobilization around the double down, triple up campaign. So very much looking forward, but also civil society mobilization. And I will end on this here with the positive news from developing countries, which Ute, you had shared with us, but also the fact that I think Janet has shared this in the background channels, that there is a COP28 political declaration on renewable energy, energy efficiency and coal that the EU, the US, Kenya, UAE, Barbados, Chile, and the Federated States of Micronesia are pushing. This has gone out and is specifically looking to APEC countries, but also JETP countries. So I think there is indeed an opportunity to increase energy literacy and make renewable energy and energy efficiency the top one line of everything that comes out from COP. Thank you so much to all of you, and looking forward to have the discussions and continue them. Thank you.
Thank you.